Dear viewers, a warm welcome to our EFEX webinar on stakeholder engagement in EU energy and climate policy. My name is Matthias Duwe. I'm head of the climate team at Ecologic Institute, a Berlin-based think tank on environmental policy. EFEX, that project acronym, stands for Energy Future Exchange, and it's a joint project that we are running with our sister institute in the US and the American Council for an Energy Efficient Economy, ACEEE. It is funded through the European Union's program on transatlantic civil society dialogue, and we are particularly grateful for the support of the EU delegation to the US as our contact points in the European Commission. EFEX aims to create dialogue on exchange on a range of energy and climate policy related issues, specifically renewables, energy efficiency, and innovative mobility. In this webinar today, we want to look at stakeholder engagement in policymaking in the field of energy and climate policy to see how civil society organizations in the EU can participate in the processes that decide specific actions at national level. And so we are taking the example of so-called integrated national energy and climate plans, a new tool in EU policy to help EU countries organize their respective targets and policies. And here to tell us more about this process and these plans are three dedicated experts. I'm very glad to welcome Lisa Martellucci and Agnese Ruggiero from Carbon Market Watch, which is an international NGO with a unique expertise in carbon pricing, but they have been working on a whole range of EU policy specifics and are following this process in a lot of detail. And we also have with us David Donnerer from Energy Cities, which is the European Association of Local Authorities in Energy Transition. And the three of them and their respective organizations are part of a project called PlanUp that has specifically looked at these national energy and climate plans and how they have been drafted in a range of EU member states and how stakeholders have been able to engage in those processes. And so they are particularly well placed to talk to us about their experience and their insights and how that process has been going so far. And we thank you very much for joining us today, all three of you. To get us started, I would ask that you kindly start us off with some essential background. So, what are the legal obligations for stakeholder involvement in the EU more generally?
Thank you, Matthias. Thank you for hosting this webinar and inviting us. So indeed, to talk about the role of public participation in national energy and climate plans, we might want to take a few steps back to talk about the legal framework that give the opportunity to be involved in the public participation processes. The first and the most important one is probably the Aarhus Convention, which establishes a number of rights of the public as individual or associations, and it was ratified by EU member states in 2001 and became legally binding in 2005. The Aarhus Convention is built around three main pillars, which are the access to information, the public participation, and the right to review the public procedures. So the access to justice, in a way. With regard to the first point, the access to information, this means that parties of the Aarhus Convention are required to proactively disseminate information on the state of the environment, which concern air, atmosphere, energy that might affect the state of the environment, and measures and policies. With regard to public participation, the parties of the Aarhus Convention have to make sure that stakeholders have sufficient time to be informed, be prepared, and then actively participate in the policy decision making. While the third point is indeed, as I said before, the right to review procedures, to challenge them, to challenge public decisions if the first 2 points have been omitted in the process. how the EU has, let's say, implemented this Aarhus Convention is through three main directives, which are the Public Participation Directive, the CEA Directive, which stands for Strategic Environmental Assessment, and Access to Information. I think that probably the second one is the most relevant here, as is mentioned in the governance regulation in the Article 10. So these are, let's say, the three main points that, let's say, provide the background for the legal background for public participation in the NECPs and the EU law with regard to climate and environment.
And so, you know, that means there are general obligations for involving stakeholders, and I'll happily follow up on them later on and ask you, you know, how well those been implemented in your specific example. But let's go to that one. So, you know, you just hinted at another piece of legislation, the governance regulation, which is the one that provides the legislative background for this whole mouthful of the integrated national energy and climate plans. Kindly, you know, give everybody a bit more background on that legislation and then that process. You know, what are these plans meant to do?
Indeed. So as you mentioned, there is the integrated national energy and climate plans are plans that all 28 EU member states have to draft in an integrated manner. But this is to achieve what? Is to achieve the 2030 energy and climate goals established in the energy and climate framework at EU level. And the governance regulation that was approved in 2018 sets out the planning and reporting requirements for all European member states. And this is to include a clear framework and a mandatory template. And this is what the integrated national energy and climate plans are, and are supposed to help member states plan, but also report on the policies, measures, and targets that they want to achieve in terms of energy and climate policy. They're integrated because they really look cross-cutting at 5 dimensions. And they present and put forward policies and measures to attain 3 main targets. There are greenhouse gas emissions reduction, renewable energy share, and energy efficiency improvement. The national energy and climate plans are a 10-year plan that will look at, for the first time, 2021 to 2030. So member states are currently planning for the next decade. And so the first draft of the plan was supposed to be ready by the 31st of December 2018. And all member states have submitted these plans more or less in time. And then the European Commission was to review the plans, and they did that. And now the final version has to be ready and submitted to the European Commission by December 31st this year. And the plans will be updated every 5 years, with review processes starting about 2 years in advance. And they have to cover the main structure of the National Energy and Climate Plan, as to include the objectives, so the targets, the policies, and look at the impact that the policy measures will have in achieving the targets, but also on social and co-benefits, such as air quality, employment, health, and other co-benefits. When we look at, in particular, at public participation, the national energy and climate plans have to be, so member states have to provide early and effective opportunity for the public to participate and engage in the process. So, and the keywords here are early and effective, and that's what we are trying to analyze and looked at for the draft of the plans. Now, there is also a little detail, at least, to look at in the legislation, because for the first set of plans, so that those that go between from 2021 to 2030, the engagement of the public is only on the final plan according to the governance regulation. While for the coming reviews and the updates of the plan, already also the draft should be submitted for consultation. But nonetheless, whether the consultation has happened for the draft or will happen for the final plan, it is of utmost importance that the public be engaged and involved in the process, as well as civil society and local and regional authorities. So in our project, for now, we've looked at what's happened for the draft plans, and we will also look at how well the public was involved for the finalization of the plans.
If I just can add a quick note on the PlanUp project. Indeed, PlanUp, as you said, closely follow the development of the national climate plans. We specifically look at 3 sectors and the public participation element. We have organized a series of events with the scope of building capacities of 2 main groups, which are civil society organizations and local and regional authorities. And indeed, we also want to share the best practices that can help to promote well-designed and friendly sectorial policies. Our focus countries are Italy, Spain, Romania, Poland, and Hungary. We also want to make sure that there is improved understanding of the economic and social benefit of climate mitigation action through quantitative and modeling tools, because often stakeholders are not really aware about these tools. And so with a combination of open online platform events and the use of modeling tools, we really want to enhance the capacity of the stakeholders to participate in the development of the draft and the final process of the national climate plans.
So, that obviously has me and others curious, what you found. So you have, your focus countries where you've engaged with those stakeholders that you identified, and we can go about this in different steps. First, you just highlighted the fact that there's a little bit of an escape clause in the legislation for governments. At the same time, you mentioned earlier how there's general legislation in the Aarhus Convention that obliges member states and the EU to actually carry out effective participation. So, in that difficult connection between these different legislative pieces or commitments, what have you found? How have member states actually, in the drafting of the plans, engaged stakeholders so far?
Yeah, thank you, Matthias. So what we found in particular for the focus countries of the Live PlanUp project, but which actually also applies to the other EU countries that are part of the governance regulation, is that there's overall a very weak involvement of stakeholders and the public. So generally, member states saw this exercise of drafting the national energy and climate plan as a mere reporting exercise to the EU Commission without thinking much about stakeholder or public involvement. What we found in the focus countries of the PlanUp project is that at least Romania and Hungary did the effort of consulting stakeholders before submitting the draft National Energy and Climate Plan. So Romania did a very short public consultation, which lasted some 10 days, where stakeholders could submit written comments on the draft plan before it was submitted to the Commission. While in Hungary, a questionnaire was sent out by the government to over 130 stakeholders, where the stakeholders could provide very general input on the NECP. In Spain, on the other hand, there was very selective involvement of stakeholders. So just the big energy utilities like Iberdrola were consulted for the draft national plan. And generally what we observed in the focus countries, but as well as in other EU member states, is that there is no real multi-level dialogue being implemented for the development of the plan, and also not foreseen really for the implementation of the plan. So that's a clear shortcoming that we identified. And we also saw that so public consultation were already done by some member states, but not all yet. And if they were done in a very short time frame. So we speak about maximum 1 to 2 months that stakeholders and the public have the opportunity to comment on the draft NECPs. And the issue with that is that the NECPs are often 200 to 300 pages long, very technical, very detailed, require a lot of time to really get into. And so 1 to 2 months is quite a short time for stakeholders really to contribute to the plans. And finally, what we also saw in the analysis is that the documentation information on the plans and on the process were not provided in an early and effective manner. So oftentimes, for example, local authorities were not even aware that the government was drafting a national energy and climate plan, because the government, like in Romania, for example, did not inform the local authorities about this plan. So this is, early and effective manner was really not the case in terms of stakeholder engagement. And if we go to the next slide. So through the PlanUp project, we try to address the shortcoming of this lack of engagement by organizing a series of roundtables with ministry officials, where we brought together civil society organizations, local authorities, and ministry officials in the 5 focus countries of the project, with the aim really to see where the barriers lie for public participation, and secondly, also to see how the national government can best use civil society and city actors in the development and implementation of the national energy and climate plans. And what was interesting from the perspective of the ministry officials that participated is that they saw the timeline of the entire process stipulated by the governance regulation as the main barrier, meaning that there was not enough time for the government to properly consult with the stakeholders and the public. So the main issue was that the governance regulation was adopted at the 24th of December 2018, and the draft plans had to be submitted 1 week later, basically, to the Commission. So for some member states, this was identified as an obstacle to properly involve the stakeholders and the public. And on the other side, we had city actors and the civil society actors saying that the general format of the public consultation was really insufficient to properly co-design a strategic document like the National Energy and Climate Plan. So from their perspective, such a plan in all its details would require really a broad dialogue and other formats, such as, for example, working groups or committees or task forces to really leverage the contributions of stakeholders and cities and civil society in a productive manner. And secondly, they also saw that they were not properly used in their roles by the national governments, meaning that the governments did not consider that civil society and local authorities can be used to mobilize citizens for more ambitious energy and climate action, which would then lead to making the National Energy and Climate Plan more ambitious and more robust also. So this was identified as the main gaps by the civil society and city actors that joined the roundtables of the PlanUp project.
And from your perspective and the many conversations that you've had, were there additional challenges. So one that I could imagine is actually just having the sheer capacity and the expertise to engage in the types of questions that that are basically being consulted on. So is that also a potential hurdle to effective participation?
Well, it's not generally how the questions were phrased, but more about sometimes the consultation was too narrow in its scope, so stakeholders could not provide like the input they would wanted to provide to, because sometimes the questions were triggered towards a certain direction that which is kind of limiting in what stakeholders can really input to the national plans. And also there was a missing part on modeling, for example, on the assumptions of the assumptions indicated in the national plans. But yeah, I mean, it's not about much the capacity of the actors, but more about also the format that did not provide the proper opportunity for the stakeholders to contribute.
Right. So thank you already for those additional insights. And David, since you presented that piece, I wanted to also ask you specifically, you know, as Energy Cities is representing local authorities, you know, what's your specific perspective on this process and the involvement of cities? You know, to what extent do they have the ability to engage, and is your understanding and from exchanging with your members, are they interested? Do they try to engage in, and what, if any, unique constraints are they facing as the types of actors that they are, you know, different from maybe NGOs that work on policy at the federal level, maybe more often?
Yeah, so that's indeed a good question, because cities are quite a unique actor in terms of the process of the national plans. Firstly, because there is actually a specific part in the template of the plans where there's to be indicated how cities and regions were consulted in developing the plan. And cities as such, we have to say that many cities are not the capital cities and don't have the resources of really the big cities that you would see, for example, in networks like C40. So they cannot engage really on their own, but rely on intermediate actors to provide their input to the national plan. So this is, for example, there can be city networks at the national or European level. It can be also local initiatives, such as, for example, the Covenant of Mayors or the European Energy Award, for example, or also an institutional actor like the European Committee of the Regions. Although in this regard, it has to be said that the Committee of the Regions is not as an agile actor as, for example, a city network or a local initiative. So the processes would take much longer if the cities would only rely on the Committee of the Regions to contribute. And as mentioned before, a larger city, a capital city, can directly engage with the government on the national plan. And we've seen that many capital cities have actually provided the direct contributions. So for example, in Hungary, the city of Budapest provided a contribution on its own to the draft national plan. And also in France, the city of Paris, which is very well placed and has the resources to provide an input, has done so. And another opportunity that cities have to engage in the national energy and climate plan process is through the Covenant of Mayors initiative, and in particular through an institution which is the Covenant of Mayors board, which consists of the presidents of the main city networks in Europe that regularly meet with commissioners and MEPs on the national energy and climate plans. And they often provide their input, in particular to the commissioners, on what they would like to see in the process in terms of highlighting the role of cities and in particular establishing the multi-level dialogues, which has been, to a limited success so far, let's say. And finally, the contribution of cities to the national plans can be also a very practical contribution. So if you see the multitude of plans and strategies that cities have proposed in the last years, such as through the Covenant of Mayors or through initiatives like C40, these plans are quite ambitious and quite bold. So if the national governments would use these plans as a basis, they could raise the ambitions of the national energy and climate plans. And the plans should also be used to share responsibilities. So seeing that cities are very active, for example, on buildings and transport, the national government would then say that a larger share of the measures in the buildings and transport sectors should be taken on by the cities themselves in order to support the achievement of national targets. But nevertheless, we should not forget that even if cities can do a large contribution, their action is still dependent on the enabling framework from the national government. So this is not only about providing the necessary financial resources, but also a good regulatory framework that really enables cities to take action. So that does not put too many constraints on their ability to invest and to undertake building codes or mobility planning that serves the purpose of ambitious policies. So if we go to the next slide on cities in the NECP process, we saw for energy cities analysis and also in the PlanUp project that only few member states really use the opportunity of the NECP process to directly involve cities. So there were some, like for example, Greece and Latvia, that did dedicated working groups involving cities to make the draft plan. So that was a very positive development, but otherwise not many member states really consulted with cities to really directly shape the draft plan. There's also a lack of recognition of the action and plans of cities and how they can contribute to achieving the national objectives, or even going beyond the national objectives. And there's also a lack of acknowledgement of multi-level cooperation. So really using the national energy and climate plans as an opportunity to better coordinate with the local and regional levels in terms of implementation, in terms of aligning strategies, aligning policy frameworks to ensure a more effective implementation of the national plans. And so what we would then see as a remedy to improve this for the final plans, at least for the end of the year, is that national governments should create specific consultation processes with cities. So this can have several formats, like, for example, the working groups as in Greece or Latvia. It can also be roundtables with city actors or involving cities through a dedicated committee or task force. So there's no shortage of options to work with cities on the national energy and climate plans. It's also secondly important to really integrate the actions and the plans of cities that are already existing into the NECP, in particular into areas where cities have the most competence and impact. So particularly the building sector, the transport sector, but it can also be in the energy sector, in particular as concerns heating and cooling, where cities have a major role to play. And finally, it's also an opportunity for national governments to use existing local initiatives, like, for example, the Covenant of Mayors and the plans that are developed in this initiative as a concrete implementation tool. So really seeing that the plans of the Covenant of Mayors, which focus a lot on buildings and transport, can serve to implement measures that are designated in the national energy and climate plans in terms of retrofitting the building stock or increasing the share of public transport or improving the modal split or increasing the number of electric vehicles. So there's really no shortage of options of how to use the Covenant of Mayors initiative for the benefit of the national energy and climate plans.
Thank you very much, David, for expanding on the way in which cities can really be better integrated as implementation actors for the plans. I think it seems very clear from that specific example as well that basically we're looking here at a case of where currently the potential for improvement in both the quality of the plans as well as forward-looking the implementation is really being underutilized by the lack of engagement of stakeholders thus far. And I have two follow-up questions. One is, and this is picking up also on what some of our viewers from the actual live webinar are posting. First of all, you were reporting on your insights from also the roundtables with ministers and other CSOs that one of the problems seems to be a potential, one was the timing, but the other is maybe also a lack of awareness of the potential benefits of engaging stakeholders. So question one is there a way that that one can win over governments to not see this as a having to tick the box exercise, but as something that really is going to make their plans so much better? And the second is, we were talking earlier about the legal background, and so from what you've reported, I would ask the question, and so did another listener: is there any possibility for challenging these practices? Is there a legal case to be made for governments that have really not lived up to the spirit of the Aarhus Convention here?
Okay, so regarding the first question, it's interesting because from the roundtables, the ministry officials that were participating, they did appreciate that they were being invited. They would not organize these events themselves, so there was no kind of proactive willingness to organize such dialogues. But if they're invited, they see it as a valuable tool to hear directly from cities and civil society organizations what the issues are. And in order to make it more, let's say, beneficial for the national governments to work with cities and in particular civil society organizations, I think it's really about highlighting more the multiple benefits that can come with it. It ultimately would make the job easier for the national government if they use the full potential of cities that's already is existing, the plans that are already being drafted and implemented by cities that focus on areas that are covered by the National Energy and Climate Plan. So, this is in particular about buildings and transport, but it's broader about decarbonization and energy efficiency dimensions of the National Energy and Climate Plan. And as regards civil society organizations, they're really grassroots, so they would really be useful in terms of mobilizing the citizens for action, really informing the citizens about the actions they can take directly to support the national objectives on how they can save energy at home, how they can commute more efficiently and with less carbon emissions. And so it's really using the cities and the civil society as an intermediary to reach out to the citizens ultimately for ultimately improving the national ambition. So that's really critical. And yes, this we highlight it in the roundtables, but We'll also have a report coming out on good practices in energy and climate governance through the PlanUp project. We'll also put this into concrete recommendations to the EU countries, how they can really engage with cities and civil society, and what are the concrete benefits that come from this. So to have it also in written and with clear guidelines and clear recommendations on how to do it. And for the second question, I mean, maybe it's Agnese or Elisa would like to come in on this. Yeah.
Yes, that's a very important question, actually. What we can say is that in countries where there was no public participation taking place, and many of our focus countries are an example of that, there is the possibility to challenge the national government. This goes a bit beyond the scope of the PlanUp project, but we are aware of groups like Client Earth that actually are trying to create this kind of pressure and challenge governments and ministries on the development of the final plans. These obviously don't concern only the national climate plans, but also the long-term strategies, where also there we saw that there is a missed opportunity. So there was no public participation going on. Again, the problem is how the Article 10 in the governance regulation is framed, and also the aspect of the CA directive. There are some countries, like for example in Italy, that they have made public consultation, and at the same time another public consultation within a strategic environmental assessment. And member states might decide to only do a public consultation within the CA directive. The difference, though, is that the strategic environmental assessments are very technical assessments, and very often what we have gathered from our partners in the project is that NGOs and civil society organizations don't have the capacity to properly implement in these consultation processes. So also going back to what David was saying, in terms of barriers, is not only, let's say, indeed the question of the time frame, which is really important given the complexity of this text, but also the resources that often are not, the NGOs don't have it. So indeed, member states should also consider this aspect to really have an active democracy.
And furthermore, what we can find in the governance regulation is the fact that if public participation is conducted within the framework of the strategic environmental assessment, will be deemed satisfactory for the purposes of the national energy and climate plans, which poses a barrier per se, because as we've just explained, these procedures are long. For example, as Elisa mentioned, the case of Italy, the strategic impact assessment, environmental assessment is going to last for 6 months of different working groups and the written input and expert groups. It is very technical, so NGOs like the one we work with in Italy do not have the means, the resources, the time to dedicate to such a long process. That's why it is important and it's fundamental to have public consultation. It is important to have a long time frame and to engage multiple stakeholders, but also to be able to, for them to give feedback on a policy, on policy matters, on how to implement things at local level, from citizen perspective, from small businesses, and a whole variety of stakeholders that can give practical input and will ultimately increase support for these policies within the country. A mean to do that would be, for example, the multi-level dialogues on climate and energy policies that are also included in the governance regulation. But these are, so they're supposed to be a platform. Multi-level is in also multi-stakeholder, so civil society talking to local and regional authorities, to businesses, to the general public, And but often countries don't have this kind of platform in place yet. They're supposed to put it in place for the national energy and climate plans to discuss different policy scenarios and review progress. But what we've seen is that also the commitment to establish these platforms, especially in countries that don't already have a similar structure, is not there. And we are still advocating for it, and especially with the work that David is doing as well on mobilizing cities and local authorities. We will keep pushing for the establishment of these platforms throughout the project and after the finalization of the plans as well, because they should be also used for the review of the plans as well and the updates and so on.
If I can just add another element to this, since we were talking about the legal framework, the other two directives that in a way come from the Aarhus Convention, in a way are not applicable fully to the governance regulation. The public participation directive case is not applicable because long-term strategy and national climate plans are not included in the annexes of this directive, and the access to the information directive doesn't really apply to draft version. So in a way, there is a sort of inconsistency. There is so much work to be done to make sure that these plans are really effective and involve a large public.
Thank you very much indeed for those clarifications. And if I may say though, so you are now reporting very much about the practice that we've seen. So it's a little bit looking back at the implementation of the regulation thus far. But now at this point, let's go and look forward, as you've started to do in terms of explaining what can be done to improve matters. And at the moment that we are recording, which may not be when you're viewing this, obviously, we are at the end of June 2019, and it's been exactly a week since the European Commission issued recommendations on each of the draft integrated national energy and climate plans. And so I would kindly ask you to also run us through what the Commission has made of the state of the plans, and of course, including the extent to which they have paid any attention to stakeholder involvement.
Exactly. As you mentioned, on June 18, 2019, the Commission has published the recommendations on the national energy and climate plans. They've published a communication and then 28 staff working documents, which are a detailed analysis of each plan, and also 28 fact sheets, a summary of their analysis. And I just quickly listed the main headings. So they focus on 7 specific recommendations that are overarching recommendations for all countries. And as you can see, they obviously look at whether the 2030 targets will be met collectively by all 28 member states, but they found gaps, especially in energy efficiency and renewables. They also looked a lot at regional cooperation, but also national cooperations within the relevant ministries to make this a really integrated approach. So ask not only the environment and climate ministries to look at these plans, but also involve the Ministry for Economy and Energy and social justice and so on. And use the NECPs to support industry and competitiveness and innovation, which is a major topic right now. Use the NECPs to mobilize new investment and private finance and ensure just and fair transition, and also to, even if the plans have a 2030 outlook, so a midterm, that they include also long-term objectives, so to really set Europe on a decarbonization path and compliant with the Paris Agreement. However, as you can see, there is nothing about public participation. only under, let's say, the communication is structure and recommendation, and then step forward. So what should countries do for the finalization of the plan? So they should ensure that public is given early and effective opportunities in preparing the final plans, and they should also publish a summary of the public's views in the version that then they submit by the end of December 2019 to the European Commission. This is the only, and in so many pages of communications, is the only sentence that addresses the public participation issue. And we've also obviously within our project looked at the specific and detailed analysis for each country, and no recommendation or suggestion is made with regard to public participation. There is only a statement of what's happened. So if a country has already conducted some consultation, when the country submitted the draft plan. So this is just statements of what happened in the process. But no additional recommendation and no stress on the importance of public consultation, which is something that we've already addressed and will keep putting pressure on, because it is very important, and falling short of including the public in these plans will not create support for them, and will not mobilize the resources also of private investors, for example. And we found this especially disappointing, because vis-a-vis those countries that have not conducted any public participation in the draft plan and are not particularly planning any for the final plans. And within our project, like we said, we focus on 5 countries, but as comparison, we looked at 5 more plans, namely, to go really opposite, we looked at Finland, Sweden, and France, Germany, and Portugal. And so all of the 10 countries, only 4 are committed to conducting public consultation before the finalization of the plan. And these are Sweden, Finland, France, and Germany. And for example, Poland, that has given a month for the public to, or for civil society and the public in general to give feedback on the plan, which is nothing compared to the size of their plan, is not planning any further consultation because they claim they don't have time. And with the summer in between, is really going to be tricky to then submit a final plan by the end of December. So it is going to be work that we continue to do, and we continue to advocate. Now, in terms of policy, the next steps are member states will have to take into due account of the recommendations of the European Commission, and that's why we're also going to comment on the recommendations to see if we can give a little bit more input and some more details and other, feed the discussion. The Commission will also have technical working groups like they've done for the draft plans, together with member states to help them finalize the plans. And then, like I said, there should be some public consultations in some countries for the finalization of the plans. And as I mentioned earlier, there's still time to set up the multi-level dialogues, and we'll keep working on that too.
So what are your own plans or further following this process? As PlanUp, which has been doing important work in trying to monitor, what the implementation looks like for the drafts, but I assume that we're now obviously in this process that you just outlined for finalization, but there's also this is also a process and issue that will continue, beyond the end of the year. So tell us about your own plans.
Maybe we can go to the next slide. Well, exactly, perfect, thanks. So indeed, as Agnese mentioned, we are going to publish very soon the analysis of the other five draft NECPs, including some pieces already of the recommendation from the Commission. In principle, they were supposed to be called front runner in the NECP implementation, but analyzing them, we discovered that we cannot call them like that. Then we will, as David mentioned already, we will publish a report on good practices in energy and climate governance. And then what we will do when we are back from holidays, a report comparing the planned policies in the draft NECPs with the European Commission recommendation and complementary recommendation from the PlanUp consortium. We see this as an opportunity to support NGOs and local and regional authorities to, let's say, make sure that in their member states, in their countries, there are guidelines to go from the draft version of the plan to the final version that is due in December 2019. Then our fall will be pretty busy in terms of events. So we are organizing 2 regional workshops in Warsaw and Madrid, where we really try to create enhanced regional cooperation in the Mediterranean region, as well as among Eastern European countries. And we will try to present best practices in terms of policies and measures, and having also, let's say, representatives from the ministries to give us an update on how the NECP's finalization is going in the country. And then we will have a midterm project conference in Brussels, where we'll bring together environmental groups, as well as representatives from member states to discuss about the next step in the implementation of this plan. That's what is supposed to happen in January 2020. And then, indeed, a comparison between a draft and the final plan. So this is what we are going to do, let's say, in the next 6, 8, 10 months. Then obviously the project will last until 2021, so more activities are foreseen. What I can suggest, instead of listing all our deliverables, please stay in touch. We are really trying to make sure that the PlanUp project is a sort of meeting point for people interested on the national climate plans and governance regulation. So we really are looking for input also for other groups that are working on this topic. So we normally cover through articles or through reports that are published by other organizations to have, let's say, a sort of coverage of what is going on at EU level on the national climate plans. We have a pretty active social media accounts, so and if you have any questions on our work, you can reach out to us and through the Debate Climate Initiative that is on our website.
Thank you very much for that outlook on your own activities. But before we close, I have one more question that I'd like to get an answer from each one of you on. So, in 1 minute max, can you tell me and the audience if you had one specific key recommendation that you could make based on your current experience and insights on what could and should be done better with stakeholder engagement on the NECPs, what would that be?
Yeah, I mean, maybe I can just quickly follow up. When basically we went to talk with NGOs active at the national level, as David said already, it's important to have for them a clear timeline on when the public participation is going to take place. So really define a roadmap that can allow stakeholders to know and allocate resources to really properly input on the recommendation. Also, try to overcome the barrier of the resources from the member states level, obviously. And then, indeed, be aware that this is a very important process. So member states should really, to ensure an effective implementation of their plans, they really have to ensure that all parties are involved. So it's not only a ticking a box exercise.
Anything you'd like to add, Agnesa or David?
What I would like to add is I think some governments also politically should understand that public participation doesn't mean that they will be told that they're wrong or that they're not ambitious enough. I mean, they will be, but this is a good exercise, a constructive exercise, and that getting feedback from the public, from civil societies and local and regional authorities can give them maybe additional ideas on how to do things better or easier or cheaper. So it is absolutely important that they understand that.
Yeah, and to add on the recommendation that member states, government should not be limited or should not limit themselves to public consultation as a method to engage stakeholders. I mean, there's a lot of other much more suited methods to get really good input from stakeholders, roundtables or working groups or committees. I mean, there's really other options that contribute to getting more targeted input from stakeholders than just a broad public consultation. So this should be used as an opportunity by member states for the national energy and climate plan process to use these other methods that are available and easily doable also.
Excellent, thank you. So, communication on a clear timeline, awareness of the benefits, and a variety of methods for involvement. Excellent final conclusions for this talk. I hope that to everybody watching live or as the recording online, this was useful input for getting an overview on a very much alive and active policy-making process in the European Union, how stakeholders are being engaged on helping to inform climate and energy policy making. And a big thank you to the three of you for taking the time and for sharing your insights and experience. And we wish you much success with your future endeavors under PlanUp.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And this was the EFEX webinar. Thank you very much for joining, and goodbye. And we're out. Excellent.